Last time we talked about Plato's attempted characterization of the ideal state anyway according to Plato. And that is a fundamental feature of the Platonic approach to political thought, at least as it is done in the Republic. There are other Platonic dialogues in which he's not such a utopian thinker, but in the Republic, it's right on the table. He says what he wants to do is to consider the ideal state. The reason for considering the ideal state, supposedly, in this dialogue, the Republic, is so that eventually he can figure out what justice is. He starts off wondering what justice is. He ends up the entire book. I've forgotten how this excerpt ends. Perhaps it doesn't end in the same way, but in the original Republic, he ends up the Republic establishing conclusions about what justice is. That seems to be the main theme of the dialogue, but really what he spends most of his time doing is talking about this ideal state, telling us what he thinks the state should be like if it were really run properly. The upshot of that is that the state should be run under the direction of reason. The state should be run by those who best understand how to run states. Professionals, people who are professionally trained with a rigor and with a depth of education that goes way beyond anything expected of any professionals that we're familiar with. You take, pick a profession and figure out what do they ask that students do before they're allowed to go out into their field, and it pales by comparison to the nearly 50 years of training that Plato requires of those who are going to rule. And the justification for that is in part because he has, he hopes to approach this perfect state, but that's not all there is to it. He thinks that the job of ruling people, the job of ruling the community, ruling the state is about the most important job there is. All the other jobs take a lesser place. This is the one that determines how people's lives will be. The whole state should be unified under the rule of reason. He has a kind of a monistic idea of what reason says. I mean, he thinks there is one thing and one thing only that reason will finally determine be done in any case, in any institution. He's not always sure that he knows what it is, but he's got this deep-seated commitment, just like a scientist might have a commitment to the idea that there's an answer to the questions that the scientist asks, even though the scientist may say, I don't know what it is, but I'm committed, I'm sure that there is an answer here. That's why I'm spending so much time looking for the answer. Similarly with Plato, I think he wasn't always sure what the dictates of reason would be in particular cases about how to do this, that, or the other thing, but he had a faith that there were right answers to these questions, that there was something that reason would say about how states should be run. And it would be people trained in this very, very extensive and rigorous way who would be most likely to be able to figure that out. I mean, that's the point here. It's not so much that Plato thinks he knows what all the answers are. He thinks, boy, you know what we need? We need people who really are prepared to deal with these tricky questions about how to run a state. Questions of justice, questions of practicality, questions of fairness. We need people who are really able to do that. And what are we doing now? Well, we're in a democracy, which is what surrounded Plato at the time, or at least during a good part of his life. In a democracy, we just pick people off the street, whoever's the most popular person. That's who we pick. Now, that's not a way of getting the wisest, the most just, the most able people into that office. A better way would be something like this educational arrangement. Yes, sir?
What was the average lifespan back then?
Well, I don't know what the average lifespan was, and then again, you got to compute it differently for normal people. And the citizens of Athens were a special class of persons who were supported by slaves, among other things. It's likely to have been fairly high because when we're talking about the citizens of Athens, even in its most democratic times, we're talking about a reasonably noble a part of the society that is an aristocracy. And it's always been the case that among aristocrats, the lifespan is longer than among non-aristocrats. When you talk about the average life expectancy period as it changes through time, that figure is supposed to take into consideration the peasant as well as the aristocrat. So and that makes a difference. But also there's this other thing. So I think that it wasn't so unusual for Socrates to live into his 70s. Plato, I think, lived into his 70s, maybe to 80. I think it's fairly normal for the people that we get to know about as philosophers back then to have lived long lives. Partially for the reason that we're talking about, a protected class in the first place. But there's another thing too. I think we're often inclined to overemphasize what might, in the last 100 years or so, or a couple hundred years, have seemed like a continual increase in the standard of living. But that's not accurate either. I mean, things have gone up and down and back and forth. It's varied from time to time and place to place. Different, Asian standards of life expectancy have often been relatively long-lived compared to European, for example. So, I mean, it's not too surprising that I think you're probably just surprised that Socrates is living up in his 70s. Is that part of what motivates your question?
Yeah, part of it was like how many people are going to survive 50 years of that.
50? Well, see, now that I don't know, and so I'm sort of hemming and hawing because I haven't got exact figures. I'd love to have, I could say, well, 30% of them. But the very fact that Plato makes that proposal that suggests that this training should go on that long and that the only people who should ever be allowed, even be considered as rulers are people who have gone through that training and passed their 50th year, that's some indication that there's a sizable number of people like that this wasn't a rarity. And that's my understanding of it as well. But others of you might want to check this out. It's sometimes fun to explore the web for answers to questions like these, and you can find them pretty quick. But there's also encyclopedias. Life expectancy, though, that would be a good thing to search for on the web. If anybody comes up with the answer to that, if you come up with the answer to that, I'd like something more precise. Maybe we can see it in the notes column. Okay, so the whole idea is that the state is, for Plato, is to be unified. It's kind of a static thing. He doesn't, I don't think you got evidence of this in your reading, I'm not sure. But he doesn't want it growing too much. He doesn't want it to get bigger. He doesn't want it to get littler. He seems to think that once we have the basic needs satisfied and we've got our auxiliaries and our guardians in place, he doesn't seem to imagine this as a developing or changing society. And there's a lot of evidence and other things that Plato's written that he thinks that change would be a bad thing, that the best you can hope for, you're not going to improve things much. I think his attitude was if we could just kind of establish a well-run state and then keep it going, that's what we should aspire to. So there's this kind of static, unified, stable. Stability is very important to Plato, as it is for everybody who writes in a time when war, civil war, revolution have been important parts of their experience. Stability is extremely important to Plato. And so the state is to be this kind of non-moving, no agitation inside, non-dynamic community governed by the rule of reason. I think that's the fairest way of putting this. And in a regime of justice, where for Plato, justice means not doing stuff that isn't yours to do. On the presumption that each person has a contribution to make to the society, to the state, whether that's a commercial contribution, an agricultural contribution, a crafts contribution, or a military contribution, or a philosophical governing type contribution. Each person has something that they do well and that justifies their presence in the state. I mean, it's because this person does that and makes that contribution, that's why we want that person in the state. It's when people stray from the things that they do well and the things that they know how to do, and they try to take on other roles, that's when things can go astray. That's unjust. It would be like medical malpractice. I mean, we have that opinion in our own society that not everybody should be allowed to hang out a shingle and say, I can cure your ills. You try it, and you'll find that you're running afoul of the law. Practicing medicine without a license is illegal. And the very same attitude toward people stepping into professions and trying to claim professional expertise in politics, for example, I think especially, the very same attitude that we have about, or that our society, as I don't mean to speak for you individuals, but the very same attitude that we as a society have toward people malpracticing, toward people who practice medicine without a license. That's the kind of thing he's talking about here. People who try to pretend like they know what they're doing in areas where that they don't know what they're doing. That's not just their personal whim. They are going to lead others astray. The services that they claim to provide will not be provided properly if provided by people that don't really know what they're doing. Now again, this is very dodgy. He is making this idealistic presumption that in his society, somehow people who know how to do this will have been consigned to this, and people who know how to do that will have been consigned to that. And the educational system, not just the educational system for the Guardians, but if you like, the propaganda system, the system in which everybody is guided as they grow older, it will be successful. It will have convinced everybody that this is what they ought to do. So people who are good at something but don't want to do it will have been convinced differently. They will have been persuaded in the propaganda system that what they really want to do is what they're good at. And if that's not sufficient, then it seems to me that there's some implication in Plato that the force of law might require people to do what they're good at doing. The point here, though, is that it's unjust. The basic idea of justice that he's kind of getting at here is the idea that it's unjust for people to be horning in on what really belongs to other people. People should stick to their own. People should do what's theirs to do and not what's somebody else's to do. It's an imposition not only on the somebody else, but it's an imposition also on the rest of society if the service is then, or the thing that they try to do is then not well done. Yeah?
So you're saying that this is his recipe for a just society, and as soon as one person, it only takes one person goes astray, the whole society becomes unjust, not just that what he just done, that person had done.
Yeah, technically speaking. I mean, just in the same way that if we have a perfect society, we're imagining a perfect society, and there's this one little teeny flaw over here, then it suddenly goes imperfect. Right. It's imperfect. Now, he's not a fool. I mean, he's going to understand, and there's some evidence that he actually tried to bring this theory into application in Syracuse. He thought he had an inside track with the ruler of Syracuse, and went there, and the idea was, I think he was trying to train the prince, the heir to the throne, whatever it was. I don't know what the story is. I should, but I don't. He tried to train the heir of the throne to become a philosopher. In other words, here's this slogan that you've seen: until philosophers become kings or kings become philosophers, we're going to be ill-governed. So he was actually brought to Syracuse with the consent of the ruler and with the objective of trying to make this king's son into a philosopher. And the whole thing ended up a fiasco. I think he was arrested. Probably for turning his son against his. I don't know. But this is all somewhat uncertain information. So he was not entirely impractical. I think he would have understood that These ideals can only be brought into reality to a certain extent. But technically, I mean, you have to admit that it is true that if you're talking about an ideal state, if you're talking about something that's perfect, then even the slightest little flaw over here doesn't render the thing bad necessarily. It renders it, though, imperfect. I mean, that's just the definition of imperfect. It has a flaw. So here no differently. In the state, if there's even just one I mean, if you're trying to figure out what's the ideal is where everybody is not, is content, actually, to play their role. To play their role. Their role being defined as what their optimal contribution is to the society. And not to try to play the roles of anybody else. And so if that's the ideal, then if even one person says, hell with you, I'm not going to do it, or maybe doesn't say that because they don't want to get in trouble, but they just don't do it, or they don't do it right, or they sort of fiddle around with the government over here, fiddle around with trying to practice medicine. If even one person strays from this mold, then at least you can say, according to Plato's view, it's no longer perfect. Exactly.
So it's unjust.
It's and therefore not perfectly just, right? And thus unjust. That's an injustice. But that's not different. See, I hope you're not. I mean, does that make you think that there's something especially? I mean, there's lots of utopian stuff in here, but that's not.
So far, it seems like his opinion of just society, his model of it.
I didn't hear the whole sentence. What?
It seems like this is his model. It almost seems like it's opinionated.
Well, of course it's opinionated. It's
But-
his, huh?
But there's no, it's his direction, and he comes up with different things to back it up, but,
But that's what I want to give a but.
it doesn't quite make any sense by.
I can put it a different way and see if it sounds the same to you. This is what he thinks the ideal society would be, and he offers us what he thinks are good reasons for us to believe it too. He offers us argument. He offers us a rationale for drawing the same conclusion. Now, there's a but. I mean, he offers us a vision of society, gives us all of his reasons, not about all, but gives us as many reasons as he can why we should agree with him. Now, is there something he should have been doing that's different?
I guess not.
Because I think I wanted to get the reason I'm sticking on this is because it's not opinion. I mean, opinionated is, I mean, in one sense, well, of course it's opinionated because this is his opinion, this is his view, but he doesn't just assert it and then try and push it on us in any kind of at least it seems to me, a pejorative sense. He asserts it and then offers a defense, leaving us in the position to say, here's where your argument goes wrong. Leaving us in a position to say, I see your point and I see your argument, I just don't buy it. Now let me see, where is it that I disagree with your reasoning? Or maybe it's the presumptions. As a general rule, when you're offered an argument, there's two ways that the argument can go wrong. Either the presumptions on which it's based, either those presumptions aren't really plausible. Or, even if the presumptions are plausible, there might be something wrong in the line of reasoning. There might be something that somewhere in reasoning from the presumptions to the conclusion, there's an error in logic. There's something that doesn't follow. When people actually lay out their reasoning, give us arguments, it seems to me that they do us a favor. As wild as we might think their conclusions are, they explain to us why they think we should buy the conclusions too, giving us the opportunity to figure out where it is that we part company with them. And then, of course, what they're banking on is that while we may at first think their conclusions are wacky, if we simply look at the presumptions, we too will see that those presumptions are reasonable. And then if we simply go along with them in the argument, just like in a geometric proof, we too will see that the conclusion is supported by those presumptions. What Plato is, and again, this isn't just a matter of bandying about opinions. Plato, and like other philosophers, in the sense of people who are, sort of lovers of reason, may very well expect, and it's transparent that he does sometimes, may very well expect that we'll find the conclusions just nuts. I mean, for example, you may or may not have read carefully the part where he recommends that men and women have the same status among the auxiliaries and the guardians, that men and women alike should train together, that men and women alike should barracks together. Men and women alike, this does sound sort of like contemporary military more and more, but that there's no reason to imagine that gender alone is going to make a difference in deciding whether someone can be an auxiliary, that is a soldier, or can be a ruler. But all around that little section where he talks about that, where he presents that argument, he says, boy, people are really going to scream at me. I mean, I know this is going to make the whole thing, this whole theory of mine, sound absolutely wacky. Because remember, he's writing in his case, about 2,400 years ago. And while that's not so, it's not quite as long a distance intellectually as sometimes we might think. There were societies in which something like that was practiced already back then. Nonetheless, I mean, he knows that the conclusion is going to sound strange to his immediate audience. And what he is trying to do then in the text is to show why, even though I know the conclusion sounds strange, here's why you should buy it. It's the correct conclusion. And he offers something I think Plato offers something that he thinks comes real close to a proof. You might not think it comes close to a proof, but it is supposed to be at least a plausible argument. So yeah, it's his opinion, but it's his opinion supported by his reasons. And I think that's something stronger. And that's why, as we read these philosophers throughout the quarter, it's not just important that you get the bottom line. Like, what does he think? What does this person think the state should be like? Or what does this person think about some other issue that we may discuss? It's not just the bottom line that's important. What's important is the reasoning. What reasons are offered? What evidence, perhaps, sometimes is offered for drawing this conclusion? It's then that you can make an assessment. It's not just some sort of wacky view that somebody has displayed before you. They say, here's why you should buy it, and you can review it, and you, independently of me, independently of everybody else in the classroom, you can decide what you think of that line of reasoning. So thanks for bringing that up, because it's really important to sort of distinguish between just the statement of an opinion on the one hand, and the statement of opinion together with a respectful presentation of what reasons there might be for holding that opinion. Now, sometimes it's going to be hard to tell, draw a line between this kind of respectful, rational presentation of reasons and then bold efforts to persuade. Sometimes it can be hard for the speaker to make that distinction, let alone for the listener. But I think that there is some sort of distinction to be made in there. At least something to be alert to. When people really try and offer you reasons that you might find compelling for believing something that you hadn't believed before. All right, so now the next thing, and I'm still trying to make this transition to Plato, and what I'm doing right now is highlighting particular elements, crucial elements in Plato's view, where we're going to see, at least in most cases, a sharp contrast between Plato and Aristotle. So Plato exclusively sought an ideal state. He thought the entire state should be unified under the rule of a kind of a static, abstract, almost geometric notion of reason. He was really enamored of mathematics. And his view of justice was that, once we figured out where everybody should be in the state, they should stay there and be content. The auxiliaries and guardians, in particular, are very interestingly portrayed. I'm trying to think if this is accurate. I'll say something that may be bolder than is absolutely accurate, but it's an important impression that I want to communicate, or at least to lay out before you. It seems that every individual difference that you might be able to think of, every individual difference among different auxiliaries, different guardians, is not only not attended to, but it's to be weeded out, if possible. I mean, the Guardians, especially the Auxiliaries and the Guardians, those two classes, they're like the Borg, right? It almost seems like they're in Star Trek, in The Next Generation. It's like the Borg. I mean, it's like there's sort of it's not quite like the Borg. Each of them is pursuing wisdom on his or her own, but Plato's view of what that means leaves the strong impression like, well, it's going to mean the same thing for all of them if we do our training right. And they're to think of each other as brothers and sisters. They're not supposed to have special interests in any person. I mean, no one of them is supposed to have any particular concern for any other person. You try anything that sort of might naturally lead to such preferences, like marriage, like knowing who your kids are, knowing who your parents are, knowing who your brothers, your real biological brothers and sisters are. All of these considerations are supposed to be blocked out, obliterated. You're not supposed to know that stuff if you're in the Auxiliaries or the Guardians. You can't have property. You can't prefer. You can't want to have things. All you can do, you love reason and you pursue reason and justice. You don't even want to be a ruler. But you don't have to be really dragged kicking and screaming back to the Oval Office or to the place wherever the ruler rules, because the rulers will understand that this is what's just. They have been provided with an opportunity to pursue what they love, namely reason, and it's only right and proper and just, and they are, of course, the wisest people, and the community, the state needs the wisest people to be the leaders. They'll understand that from time to time they have to take their turn at ruling. Now, Aristotle on Plato. Please note, I think we left off last time, I'm not sure, we left off last time with a gesture toward the particular things that Aristotle says about Plato. There's lots that Plato and Aristotle have in common. Aristotle was Plato's student, so he's living 300 BC, in the 300s, in what they call the 4th century BC, in the 300s. And he's Plato's student. He studied with Plato for, I think, something like 15, 17 years, something like that. Long, long time. But he disagrees with his teacher on many important points. Aristotle is also, his background, Aristotle is, his father was a physician. Aristotle is interested in biology, in the biological sciences. He collects things. He's one of the greatest collectors that we know about in history. He collected in order to do his political philosophy. Instead of just sitting back in his ivory tower, is it ivy or ivory? It's ivy, right? Ivy, but I always want to say ivory. You think ivory too? I'll bet you it's ivy, and we're all wrong. Because ivory doesn't make any sense, does it? Ivy does, though.
It's from a fable.
What's the fable? Larry and the Ivory Towers.
Rapunzel, yes, the one with the long hair.
Oh, Rapunzel. There's nothing ivory in there.
Ivory is made out of ivory.
Yeah, the tower's made out of ivory.
All right.
It's slippery, so you can't climb over it.
Aha. It's made of elephant tusk.
Lots of those.
Okay. Ivory-covered tower. Aristotle isn't content just to sit back in his ivory tower with the ivory crawling up. No, that's ivy. Ah, man. He's not content to do that. He went out and collected, a couple hundred, a little less than a couple hundred, 100 and something constitutions of different city-states and other political entities, not just contemporary ones, not just the ones that that existed in his time, but he tried to get historical data about the constitutions of other political entities. And I think he also threw in a bunch of speculative constitutions, some ways that nations or cities or states could be organized, even though none ever has been yet. Now I say constitutions because that's the way it's always put in the translations, and I think that that's probably a word that comes right out of the Greek eventually. How could he be collecting constitutions when the United States Constitution was apparently the first written constitution ever in 1776? Well, the word constitution didn't mean some written document. What he collected were descriptions of the ways the different city-states and nations like Persia, the ways they did their business, the ways they were run, how the political job got done. The Constitution, like ours is, except ours is written down, the Constitution just is the way, even if no one's ever written this down, it's the way things work. It's the fact that we have a Senate, a House of Representatives, that there is a split of power between the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch. Even if that had not been written down, if that just was the fact, that would still be, at least according to this original or older usage, that would be the Constitution of the United States. So, but he, instead of just sort of thinking, well, how should we build a state? He wanted to see, well, what are the alternatives? What's been tried? And what's happened to the ones that have been tried? What do you get when you do this? So he's kind of an empirical scientist, at least more than Plato was. And the fact that he was especially interested in biology meant that he really saw things in a kind of an organic way, even the state, even society. And we'll come back to that in a second. But what that means is that when, like for example, if somebody's dissecting an animal, as they did back then, they knew all kinds of things about, how not just animal bodies, but how the human body worked. They knew about different organs in the body and a good many of their functions, at least the more obvious organs in the body. But the thing you do if you cut open an animal and you see something in there, you say, well, what's the point of that, right? You say, well, what's that for? Which meant that what Aristotle was inclined to emphasize was telos, or teleology. In other words, he always wanted to know. He thought that probably the most, he thought there were lots of very toward way. I got the zoom, one side says T, the other side says W, so I think it must mean toward and way.
Telephoto and white.
Huh?
It's telephoto and white.
Oh, okay. I don't know, but way works just the way I want it to. Toward and way. Telephoto and wide angle. All right. Telos and that means what Aristotle was interested in pursuing was the end, the point, the purpose, the goal, the function. Now, this isn't supposed to be a lot of different things. I'm just trying to find a lot of different words that sort of crawl around the same basic idea. He knew that there were lots of other things that you might want to know if you're going to try and explain things. As a matter of fact, he did a brilliant analysis of several different styles of explanation, which, according to him, if you really wanted to explain something, you'd have to know all of these things. But the telos, or the end, or what he called the final cause, for Aristotle, that was his favorite. That was the one he thought, I believe it's fair to say, he almost always thought this is most informative. If you want to understand something, figure out what its point is, what role it plays in a larger whole. What's its goal, purpose, function? Now, where Plato thought that what we ought to be doing, or at least he spent all of his time doing this in the Republic, is an analysis of the ideal state, of the perfect state. Where he did that, Aristotle, well, he didn't part company entirely from Plato. He thought that the ideal is valuable, and you'll see that that comes up again and again in the written stuff that you've read. But he also insists that it's not enough, really, just to spend all your time talking about the ideal. It's also vital for an analyst, somebody who's trying to understand society, to talk about what's practically achievable, what people could really make. And according to Aristotle, that's going to vary from circumstance to circumstance. What's practically achievable? What is the best state to have will vary with conditions. Sometimes it might be that you'd need a democracy. Other times it might be better to have an aristocracy. Now, he has his favorites. He still thinks some are basically preferable over others. But he is this much different from Plato. He thinks that we shouldn't just be looking at the ideal. We should be looking at the conditions in which ideals may be brought to practice. And where the conditions vary, it may be that the best state would vary too. So he's open to a pluralism. Again, this sort of suggests a kind of an empirical spirit which makes him different from his teacher. Where Plato thought that the whole state should be unified under one kind of static rule of reason, the rule of the philosophers who know best and who are wisest. And where for Plato the guardian class had almost, that was like a unity that admitted no individual differences from one guardian to another, from one auxiliary to the other. Aristotle argued at great length that too much unity is the death of the state, reminding us of things that even Plato had talked about. The reason people form communities, according to Plato, is because of their differences. Right? It's because different people have different skills. Different people have different skills. And the whole point of the state, the function, the telos, has something to do with, for Aristotle, with humanity. This is going to get dodgy when we talk about, probably next time, when we talk about the difference between organic views of the state and instrumental views of the state. That came up before, but we're going to talk about it a little more. But Aristotle's at least this much the instrumentalist. He likes analyses that occur, that are done on the basis of purpose, goal, and function. He thinks that the state has a function in the life of humanity that has at its very center the idea that in the state, different people come together, different people join forces. And his one strong criticism of Plato is that Plato is emphasizing unity too much, as if he's forgetting that that the state is a group of different people. That's its glory, that's its point. And criticizes similarly the guardians and the auxiliaries as being so set off from the rest of society. Remember, the guardians and auxiliaries, they're going to be a minority, but they're going to rule. Everybody's going to be happy about this because they're going to do a really fine job. But still, it's almost like, for Aristotle, it's like a garrison. It's like you got two societies here. You got one society, that's the guardian society, and then you've got these other peons, sort of, these other people who are out there supporting the first society. It's not really a state. It's one state ruling over another. It's a garrison. It's like you march the army in there, and the army runs things. The U.S. occupation of Japan, or Russian occupation of places they occupied. And so he criticized it on that grounds. It doesn't sound like a state to him. It sounds more like a military occupation. But then Aristotle's way of resolving this is a little peculiar to our way of thinking. Because on the one hand, the criticism, where you say, well, it sounds like it's like you've got two societies here, and you got the one people, the people who are actually doing the governing, that's one society, and then there's all these other folks who are governed, that's another society. That might lead us to think that he's sort of moving towards something more democratic. But that's not the direction he's going. And as we may discuss further next time, his inclination is to think that the people who are not doing the governing wouldn't really be citizens in any kind of a full sense. that for Aristotle, only those people who are in a position, that partially requires leisure, only those people who are really in a position to partake in the governing of society, only they are the real citizens of the society. So I don't know what that would mean for ours. It wouldn't be me. Voting isn't enough. I mean, it would be like in the United States government, I think it would be the government, or the people who go in and out of government. I mean, there's lots of people who are right now, have been in the government, maybe in the government in the future. It's whatever class of persons really might wind up having a share in the rule of the country. Those are the people who are the real citizens. So he sees a problem in Plato that you've got two states here, but he sort of says, well, what we've got to do is to spice up what's wrong with that is not that we should include the lower, the class of artisans in the society. It's that we should explicitly say, well, they're not citizens. Now, one confusing thing about Aristotle is that quite frequently he appears to think that the only real citizens of a state are the people who participate fully in its governance, people who are part of the government. Now, pretty clearly, it doesn't just mean the people who are right now part of the government, but the people who kind of from time to time play a role in governing. And the reason that's confusing, at least to me, is because sometimes it's hard for me to know then what force to place on his preference for aristocracy over democracy, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the deal is he thinks that people should have sufficient leisure time to be able to do this stuff. That people who have to, like we do, who have to spend full time, earning a living to support ourselves, to raise a family. We don't have slaves or employees or somebody else to do our daily work for us. We don't really have the leisure time to do this. Aristotle thought, well, that's fine. Folks like us are needed to support the state, but in some technical sense anyway, we shouldn't really be considered citizens. So the only citizens are the people who really do things like do the day-to-day governing activities. And for us, it would be, who is it that does the day-to-day, who has the leisure and who does the day-to-day governing? Well, in the nation, it would be the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and I guess maybe the members of the judiciary, the Supreme Court anyway, people who sort of consider what the law ought to be. It's kind of divided up, and how extensive the group of people are who actually do the governing, that's a matter that's possibly debatable. But it's precisely for this reason that that we don't have a full technical democracy in which the entire populace votes on every issue, and then whatever the majority says becomes law. We've got a layer of representatives who we hire, if you like, to do the governing for us. And in some sense, they're the ones who are the Aristotelian citizens. Maybe, if he's really serious about this idea that only people who take part in the government from day to day are citizens. Now, another interpretation that can be placed on this is it's not just the people who move in and out of government who are the citizens, who really do the governing. It's anybody who is positioned so that they could become a senator or a representative. Now that then would at least technically make all of us eligible, right? Because unless we've committed a felony or something like that, we, at least as the ones who are American citizens, could run for office, could hold office, could, in principle, take part in the governing of the nation, of the state. So then, if you interpret it that way, then we're back with the normal range of people being citizens. It's whatever group of people continue to be eligible to do that. I guess you might want to say all the voters on yet a more liberal interpretation. But Aristotle really thinks that the state isn't just some kind of a machine that's supposed to provide us with basic necessities. It's something that aims at something better, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. But I did want to call your attention to the fact that as far as Aristotle's concerned, the real citizens are the people who actually partake in the working of government. If you consider smaller communities instead of the United States of America, consider smaller communities, maybe that's where we are more like citizens in Aristotle's sense. If we indeed sometimes might run for a town council office or participate actively in at least the debates of issues that come before our town or our local, our community. To the extent that we do that, I guess that qualifies us more as citizens in Aristotle's sense than does the simple act of being eligible to vote or having been born here. It's certain that Aristotle doesn't think that willy-nilly everybody who is born in a particular place ought then to be considered citizen. There has to be some measure anyway of at least potential participation in the running of things in order to qualify as a real citizen. And while the other folks are there, they're kind of just necessities. In order to have this whole project, the state, you're going to need people who are growing crops, selling things, buying things, exchanging things, doing business in a variety of ways. That's a necessary foundation for the state, but the state itself is something that rises up on top of that. Now, we were talking about the comparison of Aristotle's view and Plato's view. Remember, for Plato, justice, which is supposedly the main theme of the Republic, justice he finally winds up defining as a situation in which people are pretty much keeping in their appropriate places in society. They're doing the things that they're meant to do. Now, there's a lot of different ways to look at that. The one that seems most plausible to me, and it seems like that's always the nicest way to interpret anybody, is that he means that at least to refer to the business of governing the state. And they're talking about city-states, of course. But in the governance of the city-state, justice involves the people who are doing the governing, or who are best at doing governing. They're the people who should be the governors, the rulers, the people who make the decisions. And everybody else ought to keep out of that particular business. Now, I think that justice can be defined much more narrowly, and so that each of us winds up having some special contribution that we're supposed to make. But this is all in terms of this, for Plato, for the overall state project. I mean, in order for what would be the ideal of justice in the state is if everybody was making the contribution to the state that is the best thing that they can do. And you begin to see there some of the symptoms of what I mentioned before, namely that Plato is clearly an organic theorist, and we'll get to that distinction in a second. But he plainly thinks that the state, by the time it's up and running, has kind of a value in its own right, and then it's the business of individuals to make contributions to the ongoing state project. The state is more important; it transcends the importance of individuals, rather than just being an instrument, a tool that's supposed to do something good for people. So whereas Plato makes this rather precise definition of justice, and justice becomes, at least nominally, the main theme of his most famous political work, The Republic, Aristotle is a little bit more cautious. For Aristotle, and I'm not going to make too much of this, what's just and what's right in any undertaking, in any particular case, is going to be defined by something called, that he's famous for calling the golden mean between extremes. I mean, what's right and what's just is always going to be something that's in the middle between two extremes. And this, I think, pretty identifies Aristotle as a reasonably conservative fellow, just because he thinks that what's right is always going to be the mean between two extremes. And without saying much about it, I want to call your attention to the fact that the problem with that kind of definition of right or just is that, depending on how you define your extremes, almost anything could come out right and just. What's the proper number of innocent people to slaughter if you are an axe murderer? Well, you don't want to slay too many. You don't want to slay too few. The golden mean is what's appropriate. That's something of a distortion of what Aristotle had in mind, but the idea that what's right and what's just, the idea that the way to determine that is to figure out some golden mean between extremes, that doesn't give us too many hints about which things are right and which things are just. Okay. Now, on to what I promised over and over again, namely this business about the two different approaches, two different understandings of the state. Okay. Okay, there's the organic. I'll put these in quotes because they're only meant to pick out some sort of symptoms, little kind of broad types of political philosophies, broad types of conceptualizations of the state, of the nation, of a political organization. Now, before we get into this, I want to emphasize that no political philosophy is, I think it's safe to say that no political philosophy is a pure example of either one of these things. It's just that one or another of these tendencies may dominate the thinking of a particular political philosopher. In my experience, my personal experience, and my experience with other people that I've talked to, one has a little bit of both of these tendencies in one. Almost everybody has a little bit of both of these tendencies in thinking about the community, the society, the nation. The organic suggests that the state is a kind of an organism. By that I mean at least a virtually living being, not literally a biological living being, but something with a life of its own. Organism. With value in its own right. Its value, the value of the state, does not reduce to the value, to any set of values of individual persons. The state is something that citizens not only often do, but should sacrifice at least some of their interests to. It's something that is valuable in its own right. Okay. Whereas the instrumental version of the state suggests that the state is an oh, by the way, the organic, let me put this in too. I go further back. No. Go that way, can't go that way. The state is natural. The state is a natural entity, institution. It's natural among human beings. The instrumental approach says that the state is, and often this word comes up, only, right, as opposed to the organic view, is only an instrument or tool designed to accomplish good things for individuals. State is, as tools are, state is artificial in some sense, okay? Now, we have to be cautious about this, but the thing is, the instrumentalists, those theorists who prefer the instrumental view of the state are inclined to think that the way to evaluate states is whether they're doing well or poorly as tools, as in accomplishing the ends for which they are designed. If they're not, well, then you better replace it. Get rid of it. Its value only stems from its ability to successfully accomplish certain goals that individual human beings have. Safety, perhaps, more than just safety, perhaps, not just protection, not just negative kinds of things like protection against its other human beings, whether they're thieves or invading armies from someplace else. Occasionally, the point of the state is viewed as much more positive. It's supposed to provide. We're going to pool our resources, you see, and get together, and we'll provide ourselves with things that we never could have as individuals. But it's an instrument for the provision of those goods. That's what the instrumental view says in its purest form. The organic view says, no, basically the state is something that is that transcends the mere fact of its providing us with goods of any kind. It does provide us with protection. It does do these good things for us. It does do nice things for us in the main, the organic view usually says. But its value isn't only restricted to that. Well, that's enough said for that for right now. Now, this instrumental, what's confusing about this is that what I'm going to argue is that, and this is not anything novel, but both Plato and Aristotle, in the end, tend to be both organic theorists concerning the state. And at least for a little while, they're the last organic theorists of the state that we're going to consider. Both of them think that the state has a purpose and life of its own that goes beyond the ends of any individuals. A value of its own that goes beyond the end of any individuals. However, having said that, I want to remind you that in both Plato and Aristotle's stories, they say the state arises at the beginning. Anyway, the beginning of the story is that people get together because there's certain ends that need to be met. There's the advantages of the division of labor for Plato. That's why people get together in communities, and then the state arises because it's necessary as a means for achieving the luxuries that people come to want after a little while. So it looks for all the world as if he's talking about an instrument, right? A tool. It's all that stuff sounds like He's talking about the state being an instrument that arises because it's able to provide us with certain sorts of things. However, once the state gets up and running for Plato, justice is no longer defined in terms of, of the welfare or the well-being of individual people. Justice and almost every other thing are now defined in terms of the harmonious working of this state, the harmonious continuing existence of this new organism that's been created. It's to be maintained for Plato in a stable state as much as possible. He says from time to time, and I'm pretty sure that this is in the excerpts, people raise the question with him. Of course, he's talking about an ideal state, so in a way he can get out of this question by saying, well, I'm just talking about ideals, but he doesn't do that. People say, well, do you think Plato, or Socrates, he has one of the characters say, Socrates, do you think that these guardians and auxiliaries would be happy living the life that you've asked them to lead? Do you think, he also wonders, or somebody from time to time wonders, that the other members of the state will be happy if they have to stick to doing the things that they're best at? I mean, maybe people would want to take part in the government, but you're telling them, no, you can't because you haven't gone through all of this training that the guardians need to go through. And Socrates is asked, do you think people will be happy following all these rules? And Socrates' response is, well, it doesn't really matter. We're not trying to get to what makes particular classes happy. The whole state will be happy. And by that, he doesn't seem to mean anyway that the individuals in the state will be happy. What he seems to mean is that there'll be something happy about the state. I mean, the state will be stable. The state will be in order. It's the idea that all this stuff will be now in order and that everything will be done properly. That's the ideal. It was now we'll have a well-functioning, smoothly efficient community. And somehow the individual happiness of the citizens isn't as important as that. For Aristotle, too, and this is very interesting because for Aristotle, did I talk about teleology before? Okay. For Aristotle, anything in the world is perhaps most helpfully explained, best understood if you understand its point or purpose or role. And that would seem like that would make him a prime candidate for an instrumental theorist of the state. And indeed, when he comes down to talking about the state, once again, you've got him saying, people always come together. When people come together, when they do, they're always coming together to accomplish something good, something that in common they believe to be good. The family is an organization which establishes perhaps the basic needs for survival, so that the family might be understood in terms of its end, survival. I don't know that that's a word he uses, but it seems that something that's relatively simple. It's the kinds of, it's the small scale needs of human beings are provided for in the family, especially for the children. There were evolutionary theories that Aristotle was familiar with back then, 2,300 years ago, concerning the evolution of species. Rather peculiar looking ones in some cases, but there were evolutionary theories around, taken seriously by philosophers and whoever was interested in those kinds of questions, by biologists, by people who we would now think of as biologists. So it's even conceivable that that word survival might be understood in an evolutionary sense, namely the family is something that serves the purpose of of promoting human life so that the species survives, not just so that those individuals survive. I think you could take that way. I don't think it would be too much of a mistake to think that something like that might also have been in the back of Aristotle's mind. Larger communities than that he shares Plato's view that the division of labor is a point or purpose or goal or function that is achieved by larger scale communities. Companionship, general companionship. And then finally, the state. Is something higher than that. The highest good. He says all human common efforts, whenever human beings come together, they do so in order to achieve some good. And the state has as its motivation the highest good. And all this stuff looks very teleological. It looks like he's really referring to the end, the purpose, the point of the state. And that, again, that sounds very much like an instrumental theory of the state. Here's what the state is for. It's for pursuing and achieving the highest good. By that, I think he means things like doing philosophy, doing politics, the political life, the idea that people would be able to spend time governing themselves together, working together to achieve things like a noble life. The state is always, he says, Aristotle says, the state is always its point is something noble, not just survival, not just life, but the good life, the philosophical life, the aesthetically pleasing life. That's what the state is for. It's a project that has as its goal the highest aspiration of the human species. Now, Aristotle's famous for defining humanity in this way. He says, man is the rational animal. Now, again, he's a biological theorist, and his idea is that you always explain things. When you define things, you first tell what general category it falls under. In the case of humanity, that's animal. And then you tell what is its unique characteristic within that larger group. So when he says that man is the rational animal, that's not just supposed to be a comment. It's supposed to actually specify what is the larger category in which humanity may be found. Man is an animal. And then what is it that picks humanity out? What is it that makes man special? It's man's rationality. So man's highest aspirations, the things that are important to humanity, are those things that are special to humanity. For Aristotle, what we ought to be seeking, to the extent that we are human, is not just life, but the rational life, the life of reason, and the life that's lived in the way that's peculiar to human beings. That's what we should aspire to. And that's the kind of highest good that the state is there to accommodate. Now, what stops people? What stops people from being able to pursue philosophy, art, nobility, the political life? Well, it's the requirement of having to work for 40 hours a week, or the requirement that you have to make ends meet. In a way, what stops humanity from achieving its unique status in the realm of animals, of achieving its end, its purpose, its telos, are the necessities of life. So, now this, I'm not sure whether Aristotle would actually license this. Now we're going into my some perceptions of my own, or my own interpretations of it. But it seems to me that Aristotle might have said this. Maybe I'm actually repeating something I read in Aristotle. I don't know. Right now I'm just kind of going to follow the logic of this. Where the only way that human beings can achieve this is if they can enlist the support. I mean, first of all, only some human beings will be able to achieve the true philosophical life. But doing that is the goal of humanity, is the telos, is the thing that we're here to do. It's to achieve our full potential as human beings. Now, not everybody can do that. Maybe, or at least not at first, not immediately. It may be necessary for some people to lead lives that are far less than that in order to make it possible for some people to lead the good life, the virtuous life, the noble life, the truly human life. And so that's where you get all the stuff about the rationale for slavery. For Aristotle, the rational is always superior to the non-rational, at least for human beings. So where there is any kind of a conflict between, or a need to work out an accommodation between the principle of rationality and something that's short of rationality, rationality should come out on top. You came across his justification of slavery, I presume, in the text. There, the justification is that some people are able to foresee and plan and think through complicated problems, solve them. They can see how to resolve all kinds of problems, and other people can't do these things. Some people are able to lead in the right direction toward the solution of problems. They're able to see what the solution is and to mobilize others to go get it, and other people aren't suited to doing that. Those people who foresee and who have this capacity not only to think rationally, but to not only to use reason, but to use it to resolve problems, those people should be the natural superiors of those who can't, those who are better suited to execute the plans of the planners, of the rational ones. So it's this distinction that justifies slavery. Some people are natural slaves. They're the ones that can't see, they can't do this planning stuff. But they can follow the instructions of the more rational, the wiser, the more intelligent. Now that's the justification. Now, it's important to see that he understands the relationship between the master and slave as being a symbiotic one. What the slave and the master are both after certain ends that are in the interests of both of them. That without the master, the slave would not be able to accomplish what the slave can accomplish with the master. And as some of you, I think, have seen in your judging by your notes comments, some of you have seen that you could just take the word slave out of there. I mean, it's like there's managers and there's employees, and if you think it true to say some people can manage well and other people can't, well, you've got that same relationship that Aristotle's talking about. He's just using the words master and slave. He was roundly critical of the institution of slavery as it was practiced in his own time and in his own place, because the people who were slaves were not in particular, no one even asked, are these people capable of reason? That wasn't the issue. It was, did these people lose the last battle? And that's who got enslaved, whoever lost the last battle. There wasn't even any belief that that the distinction to be drawn between slave and master had anything to do with a difference in capacity or capability. There wasn't any particular belief, I think, that this was a relationship that was good for both parties. So the institution of slavery, as Aristotle saw it, and the institution as it was practiced in Greece, was something he condemned. Now, having said that, and perhaps making Aristotle seem, I don't know how that seems to you, perhaps making Aristotle's view of slavery seem more humane, because he thought that, well, this distinction is supposed to be for the good of both. This distinction is supposed to be between, the distinction between master and slave is supposed to be between one who can foresee, one who is wise, one who has has the rational capacity in full measure, and other people who perhaps don't have it in such full measure and who need the help of the master in guiding them. That might make it seem humane, but it's Aristotle's rationale for slavery that was used to enslave blacks in the United States. It's Aristotle's rationale for slavery that you see echoed again and again and again in the documents produced by Southern slave owners. Their view was that the blacks they enslaved were precisely what Aristotle had described. They were people who were not capable of fine thought, not capable of rational planning, not capable of living a truly human life, and that what was necessary for them and for their good was that the white master take over their life and guide it in a more fruitful direction than they would choose themselves. And as the institution of slavery in the United States took hold, it became necessary for people to believe that there was a rationale for it, that there was a justification for it. And it was Aristotle's that they used. So lest you think that the benign, that Aristotle's characterization of slavery is harmless and a nice corrective to what otherwise would have been an evil institution, it's Aristotle's justification of slavery that more than anything else condemns slaves here to being viewed as lesser human beings than their masters. That was not the case in Greece. The system of slavery that Aristotle condemns, the ones that were as it was practiced there, were ones in which people could freely acknowledge that their slave was smarter than they. Because after all, they knew quite well that the only distinction between master and slave was who won the last damn battle. And it's not very difficult for people to see that there, but for the grace of God, go I. That if they had lost the last battle, they would have been a slave in Sparta or someplace else. So the attitudes of masters toward their slaves were not necessarily so denigrating as became the case in our system. And our system depended a lot on having Aristotle around to back it up. But now, getting back to something I think is a little bit more positive about the story about Aristotle and his differentiation between the rational and the non-rational. He imagines the state as being the locus of human aspiration. As such, I mean, as insofar as it represents, the highest, for Aristotle, it represents the thing that human beings, that reflects humanity at its best. That's why, even for Aristotle, who's such an instrumentalist in everything else he does, who cares so much about the reasons, the functions of things, it's precisely there where his tendencies toward being an organic theorist come out. It's because the state is for these objectively good things, that it doesn't much matter how, what it does for individuals, for individual citizens. It's because we should be sacrificing ourselves to promote this institution, this thing whose goal it is to perfect humanity. The goal of the state is to achieve the things that humanity ought objectively to achieve. And whether we like it or not, that's a wonderful, beautiful, objective goal. So, and it's a goal that transcends any individual's personal interests. All right, now, going back to this. The naturalness of the state is probably a function, if you think about this. It's a function of the fact that humanity, according to Aristotle, has this objective end, that is to be rational. I mean, to do anything less, to not emphasize the pursuit of reason would be to pursue something less than human. Because again, man is the rational animal. So what is it that man's to do? Reason. You're supposed to reason. And so to promote that is then based on the allegedly natural fact that the essence of humanity is reason. The important distinction that makes human beings is their reason. That's supposedly a natural fact. It's from that fact that we need something like the state. We need vehicles that can help us get there. Now, there's another key feature here, and that's that for Aristotle, different societies are going to be found in different conditions. And this differentiates him from Plato as well. Different societies arise in different conditions. And from time to time in the life of any given society, there will be different conditions that they find themselves in. You might say more or less primitive, if you like, more or less developed along the route toward achieving rationality. But because he understands the dynamic character of the formation of states and the life of states, of governments, he understands that that different conditions will require different modes of government. If the end goal is to be achieved, I mean, depending on what people have achieved already, that will determine what they can achieve next. And so he sorted through some 150 some, I think, different constitutions, and came to the conclusion that there were basically 6 different forms of the state. There were 3 that he called true forms, and 3 that you can call degenerate forms. Or perversions of the state. And he's forever the logician. He's the founder of formal logic. That was another lifelong, it's probably his most important contribution as far as I'm concerned, but he was a lifelong devotee of logic. One of his principal students was Euclid, who axiomatized geometry. But the way he figured this out, there's true forms and degenerate forms, and then there's only 3 logical possibilities, where there's the rule of one, there's the rule of many, of a few, and the rule of many. Okay? And in the last minute, all I want to do is to sort these out for you. Royalty is the true form of government in which there's the rule of one. There's aristocracy, And then there's what's called constitutional government. Or polity. The degenerate forms are tyranny, that's the rule of one, oligarchy, that's typically the rule of the rich, and democracy, which he understood as the rule of the poor. And this doesn't require much discussion, although it could be discussed forever. The distinguishing feature between the true forms and the degenerate forms is just this. All these true forms, whether it's the rule of one, the rule of few, or the rule of the many, all of those involve the interest of all as their primary motivation. Whereas all the degenerate forms focus exclusively on the interest of the rulers. So let me just show these examples. Tyranny is the rule of one in the interest of the tyrant. Oligarchy is the rule of the few, usually the rich, in the interest of the rich. Democracy is the rule of the many, and usually it's the poor, for the poor's sake. So it's, the poor would expropriate the wealth of the rich and divide it up among themselves. Whereas over here, in each case, without enumerating them, in each case, those who rule with the benefit of everyone in mind.